special interest group of the Geosciences Society of New Zealand. Thanks for coming. There are some brochures on the tables for the society, so please help yourself to a brochure, and we would love to have more members joining. So this is kind of personal, but yeah, thank you all for. And I'd like to start with thanking Leanne and Solon for hosting us here in the University Country. And so Leanne is going to take you through the health and safety and some housekeeping.
Hi everybody, my name is Leanne Morgan. I work here at the university and helping with the venue essentially. And that puts me in the position of being warden, which I'm so as that I have to do some safety announcements. I've been well briefed by Swellen. So in case of an earthquake, we have to drop and hold. And then after the shaking's finished, we head out these doors here and take a right, and then there's a door just out into this section here. And if you all wait by the screen, the next bit is that there's a little sheet that I'm going to hand around and get you to sign and just put your phone number. And if you're not on it, if you could add your details, because then I need to tick you off when we're standing up there. And that's it from me actually. So welcome everyone, and I'm really glad that we can host this at the university because we're getting to see the students come home, which is fantastic. Hydrogeology is an interesting field, and it'd be great to see more research from students in that area. Welcome everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, so I forgot to mention, my name is Hisham Zahour, and I work for Stantec, and I'm the convener of the special interest group, the Hydrogeology Special Interest Group. And by all means, these activities are not limited to the group or to the society, it's open to the public. And thanks for our speakers who currently joined us. They're not members in the society, but still they're very supportive. And they're also supporting the event by providing food and drinks after the meeting. For after the talk drinks, Nicola there, thanks Nicola, is going to help us. She got us to where we're going after that talk. Yeah, I would like to acknowledge Aquilink, Macmillan Drilling, and Stantec for their contribution. And yeah, that's it for me. I'd like to thank our speakers and introduce them to you. So the first speaker is Helen.
I'll just give a very brief introduction.
Yes.
Ian's taken.
Thank you. Right, I'm sure you don't want me to read through all of that, so we'll just skip onwards. If you don't know Ian, Ian sat over here, Group Manager and Project Director for specialised projects within New Zealand and Pacific Islands at Macmillan, and he's going to tell us a little bit about different drilling techniques and what you might expect to get out of different drilling techniques. So the talk is, we debated about the title. We called it "The Whole Truth is what you see, what you get." This is based on some data that the City Council collected, and I'll explain that. Ella Harris from the university, she's around somewhere. Oh, over there. Hi, Ella. Analysed the data along with some help from Justin Legg, and Ian Haycock is also contributing to this talk. So there's 4 of us all together that have been involved in this. I do like the cartoon there. This was from a Danish paper, I think, and it illustrates some of the difficulties when we're looking at any subsurface information. Not only do different techniques give you different information, but you don't often have to move very far before you're actually into a different sort of lithology or formation, which just complicates everything. So we'll be talking a little bit about that along the way. So Ian, would you like to come and continue?
Good evening, everyone. If I speak without it, is that okay? Can you hear me? Right. I feel like carrying them around. Look, thank you very much for the welcome tonight and the invitation to come in and speak with you all. Like Helen said, we actually weren't involved with this project so much in the sense that we saw the results afterwards, and what was really nice about that was it was encouraging what we saw, what we thought and understood from the role we play as a drilling company and describing the materials and the different techniques we use. The project reinforced what we sort of understood, which was great. So I'm going to talk very briefly and provide some background and context to the project, in particular the drilling methods that were considered in the project, and really try and help understand from a sampling point of view why different drilling methods may give you different results. And it's really fundamental, and probably something I'd like to really impress on you all is when you interpret logs or when you creating bore logs, having a real appreciation for drill method is so critical. And I think this project very much highlights that, because the lithology, within all argument's sake, yes, you have spatial variation, but this project was about Christchurch City Council pumping stations, where work had been done over several years and creating the municipal bores themselves, and so that's where some of the lithology comes from, and more recently using some more modern techniques to try and improve the resolution of that to inform some improvement work on those pump station sites. So the lithology shouldn't actually be that much different. However, some of the results suggest otherwise. So yeah, if I can highlight why some of those differences are there, hopefully that'll give you some background to appreciation for the next presenter. So we're going to start off with the first method, the cable percussive method. So this would have been used on these projects in the sense that they were this method was used to construct the municipal bores themselves. Okay, it's a very old technology, still quite relevant, still used today, utilised throughout New Zealand. Although you would find this technique more so in areas where there's alluvial materials, where other methods really struggle to deal with them. So hence Canterbury, the formations we deal with here. Hawke's Bay would be another example within New Zealand. Almost exclusively used here in Christchurch City for a variety of reasons. One of them is certainly the above ground artesian pressures that we deal with the aquifers. And the process enables the drilling, the advancement of casing, providing hole support, and removal of the materials. So I wanted to speak very high level about the process. The process starts off with driving an open-ended steel casing to the ground, and periodically we stop that driving action. The material, the formation, has been pushed up into the casing by the drilling process, and then we lower our tools down into the ground to recover that material. And so we might drive it, say, 1/2 metre, sometimes less, sometimes more. Okay. The tools we use to recover the material, and we have some examples of that in terms of the material that's been recovered, is with a sand pump or a shingle pump. And it has to be in a flooded hole, so we must have water in the hole. And through the action of a plunger moving up and down inside the device, it creates a vacuum. So you essentially syringe the material out of the hole, and that's brought up to the surface, and we tip the contents out on the ground or into a basin, and that way you can inspect what you've drilled through. It's worth pointing out that in some formations they don't behave at all well to suction. You won't recover that material, and that typically is in the sort of more sticky material, or you have a particle size which is quite a bit bigger, and you simply can't syringe it up. In those situations, you'd have to run a drilling tool down like a chisel, and you'd break the material up. Okay, so you've got to appreciate the disturbance you're going to create by that. You'll end up fragmenting something that's quite a bit larger, and in the case of something that's very cohesive and silty and sticky, you'll churn that up. So when you go down with your shingle pump to remove it, it looks nothing like it used to. Okay, so I've got a couple of videos here for each drilling method. This was available online. I thought it was a hole, so I thought I'd use that. So this particular one here is, oops. Try and make this one go. Oh, there you go. So it's a 12-inch casing, so 300 mm in diameter, and this is the percussion action you can hear. So it's quite a heavy drill string, a drill stem that's been lowered and lifted up. It has a set of hammers on it that sits on the squares, and that, as it hits the drive head, it hits the casing and punches it in the ground. So that particular example is he's about 70 metres in Lincoln, and every strike he's knocking it in maybe an inch or so. Okay. This is just a photo. Unfortunately, I didn't have a video of this, which shows the shingle pump, which is this device here, being tipped down onto the ground in this situation. You see the water coming out first, and that'll be followed by the cuttings. Okay. So for now, if we just look at the what that means in regards to lithology, forget about everything else, but just focus on what it means for the lithology. The advantages by using cable tool is you know exactly where that sample's coming from. It's coming from the bottom of the hole, and so depth isn't really a question. The coarse grain components are broadly intact, and if you look at the sample over here, you're getting fragment sizes like this out, and they're whole. So you know for sure that that's what it looks like in the ground. You can recover large samples, so bulk samples, and you can get a reasonable appreciation of the particle size distribution, at least for the coarse range, not so much in the fine fraction. And you can observe the groundwater response to the drilling action and get a bit of appreciation of what's happening in the ground in regard to that. The things that aren't so good, the samples can be highly segregated, okay? And that suction action I spoke about with the shingle pump, that's going to remove the fine fraction first, because that's the easiest stuff to remove. So the sands and the smaller particles are going to rush up into the shingle pump, and they're the first ones that are going to come out of the hole. And then the second or third loads, you may end up with larger materials. Okay, so you've got to try and reconstitute that at the surface and say, is it sandy at the top and then gravelly, or is it a gravelly sand? Or so there's a bit of interpretation going on there. But the good thing is, and what I said before, is it's all from that depth. You just need to work out what it looks like. The fine fraction is subject to washing, because you've got water down the hole, the hole's flooded, and when you're creating a suction action, that water's rushing to the casing, or rushing into the sampler, and you can wash a lot of the material. So the things like silts, you may not see necessarily, particularly if they're erodible. The samples are highly subject to operator influence. All right. So like most things, if you have an operator that's not experienced with this particular equipment, you could end up with some pretty odd results. And just a general comment from myself. So the method is well suited for the identification of cohesionless, saturated, coarse grain materials. That's really where it excels. And resolution, what you'd expect in your log, 0.2 to 0.5, probably at best. And that'll play out in the next speaker, before the next speaker. So the next method we're going to look at is mud rotary. It's been around for some time, but its use in Christchurch City, and in particular for municipal pump station sites, is more recent. And by more recent, I'm talking about, say, 2008, 2010. And it's not just the use of mud rotary, it's the use of dual rotary equipment using mud to create the hole. And the reason that was brought in is to accelerate the installation of these wells. So you can rapidly install casing into the ground, but invariably you will revert back to cable tool when it matters, when you're going through the target aquifer, so you increase the resolution. So it essentially advances the hole, so it drills and advances the casing at the same time. So it's not a back and forth like the cable percussive method. So you have a drill bit. It's often a tricone or a drag bit, which is rotating with the drill string. It's working slightly in advance of the casing that's following behind. In the dual rotary sense, you have one rotary operating the casing and the casing spinning, another rotary, independent rotary, rotating the drill bit. Okay, and the drilling fluid, in this case, what we call the mud, it's water bentonite, or it might have some modifiers or polymers in there. That's injected through the drill string, exits at the drill bit, clears those cuttings out of the way, and that mud rushes up to the surface through the annula. So the annula is between the casing and the drill bit. So it's a little bit like reverse circulation, if you've heard that term before. And when that mud gets to the surface, you are stripping it out and cleaning the cuttings out of it and trying to understand what's going on at that point there. So again, I've got a video for this. So you can see in this video here the bottom table, which is this device here. That's spinning the casings, and the top drive, which video quality is not great, it's spinning at the surface. And as the mud's coming up, we're getting some spillage. What I'll do is I'll just go forward a little bit, if I can. I was hoping to show you some shakers, and you can see the material coming off the solid control units. It may not allow me to do that. I need to just fast forward it. But if I can describe it, you have a shale shaker that takes out the coarse fraction. So the large particles come off that first. Then you have a separate desanded desilver that's taking the fine fraction out. Okay, so that's what you see at the surface. And you can imagine how hard it is to try and understand what's going on down the hole. I'll just go forward. So, influence on lithology, pros, or advantages, none to mention. I simply could not. I tried my hardest to try and work out if there's any pros from this, and there's simply not. It's not a great way of gaining good samples, but I could find a few disadvantages. So the soils are highly disturbed, and by that I mean massively disturbed. In terms of the coarse fraction, they are broken up into bits, and you're simply dealing with very fine cuttings. The time for the material to make its way up from the bottom of the hole to the top, and if you've got the ability to take a sample direct from the stream coming out of the hole, which is about 35 litres a second, it's hard. Otherwise, you're taking it from the shakers. That time component makes it very difficult to know if you know your drill bits at 20 litres, at what point are you seeing that material coming out? You have the secondary components which are coming up. So if the finer components, say the silt, sand, that's coming up at a much faster rate because it's lighter. The coarser stuff is taking a little bit longer. So essentially you get materials passing each other. So you get cross-contamination. And water level response, very hard to understand other than, say, if you had fluid loss or fluid gains in the system, you'd be able to discern, well, maybe we're in an aquifer that's permeable and we're losing the mud into it, or equally it's a pressurised aquifer, our muds aren't heavy enough to suppress them and we're making water out of it. So general comment, method is poorly suited for the identification or characteristic of materials other than homogeneous materials. So if you had a beautiful formation that was straight sand or straight gravel or straight whatever, well, would make it a little bit easier, and perhaps you'd have an application there. So probably a little bit generous, resolution 1 to 2 metres at best. I'd say it's sometimes a lot worse than that, and certainly becoming less accurate with depth. And that goes back to what I said before about the time it takes for those cuttings to come up out of the hole. Okay, so this is the last method that was considered, and this was used to characterise the material or the formation on these sites with a much higher resolution, and you'll understand why soon. So the sonic technology, it's been around for a wee while. It's more recent for New Zealand, certainly not new on the world stage. It's become more available and commercialised as the design and the materials of the tooling have become more reliable. In the early days, it was extraordinarily expensive and reliability was terrible. So it just simply wasn't seen in the commercial world, but now it is. And the opportunity here in New Zealand, at least, was the Christchurch earthquake. Dealing with the formations here, the sonic drilling application was very suitable to that. With all things new, it's misunderstood. It's misunderstood both by practitioners and drillers alike. that should resolve over time, but it takes some education. So, and I'm very happy to talk about that later on because we'll run out of time otherwise. So the process, we advance the casing and sampler using high frequency, so it's in the range of 60 to 150 hertz, and with optional rotation. In this project, we were rotating, so it's a rotary site, and the frequency is applied to try and achieve true resonance, which is pretty hard to achieve, but you can get close to it, and you'll go either side of it, and that's to create amplitude at the bit face and allow the sampler to shuffle into the soil. Okay, so the soil enters the sampler, passing through a core catcher to stop it falling out, and at the end of each sample run, which is typically 1.5 meters, you'll stop, you'll withdraw that sampler to the surface, and then you'll either extract the sample if it's in a plastic liner, or you'll vibrate it back out of the sampler. And then the process is repeated. So again, I've got videos of this. So you can hear that audible noise. That's the oscillator making the frequency. This is running quite low frequency at this point, probably 60 to 80 hertz. And the penetration rate, despite this video not playing very well, it's relatively fast. So we'll try and skip. Okay. This video is just showing the sample coming out of the sample barrel, and in this case it's just vibrated out. So there is some disturbance, but if it was in a plastic liner it would be retained and preserved, so it would be slightly different. Technology is not really helping the case yet. So influence on lithology. The advantages are the soil fabric is essentially kept intact. So it's definitely disturbed in the sense that it might be elongated or compressed, but if you were to break it apart, it's as you see it in the ground. So if it was, say, gravel that had a sand matrix, you'd see that. Your percentage of sample recovery is typically quite high. So around the sort of 100% mark, sometimes you'll get a little bit lower. And it's not influenced by drilling fluids. That's not always the case, but depending on what method you use for sonic, there shouldn't be any drilling fluids actually at the point where the sample is entering the sample barrel. So you don't get washing happening. There are some negatives. There are not many of them, but it's pretty difficult to preserve the integrity of a soil which has some it's slightly cemented, or it's got some apparent cohesion. That gets destroyed by the vibrations. Equally, if you had a material that in the ground it could be actually quite stiff or have some strength, if it's sensitive, those sonic vibrations will make that soil look quite different against the surface. So its makeup is the same, but its appearance in terms of its strengths will be quite different. You can get a lot of heating a sample. Particularly if it's in a dry formation and you're not using drilling fluids, you'll cook the sample, okay, and so it looks a bit different there. And you can get disturbance, or invariably you do, and again this comes down to operator influence at the start and end of each run. There'll be a little part of the soil that will either be washed or it's settled out, so you'll get a fine fraction there. So it's if you're seeing a sand band every 1.5 meters, it's not natural, so something else going on. And so final comment, it's well suited for the identification of cohesionless saturated coarse grain material. That's really where it comes into its own. The resolution, I believe, is almost unlimited because it's intact. You see what you get. But there are some issues around compaction or elongation. So you might oversample. So you might do a 1.5 meter run but get 1.8 meters of material. That's a real thing. It does happen, and you need to know it. And it's to do with the soil mechanics a little bit, but also due to the tooling, whether it's kerf positive, negative, or neutral in terms of the bit. So that's enough from me.
I'll just whiz through this. Basically, my real interest in bore logs actually came about working in Africa, in the middle of the Western Kalahari here, and we put down this very deep hole lost a drill bit down it at several hundred meters, and the only way of getting the drill bit back out was to core around it and lift the whole lot out. And this core came back out of the hole, and I thought, wow, I didn't realise that was down there. And the fact is that core gives you such a good view of what's under the ground. It's fantastic. But when we're sampling unconsolidated sediments, up to recently, we haven't had that opportunity to actually see the sample in situ, which is where sonic drilling comes into its own. Just a comment there, what's been targeted may affect description. That's just a general comment. We all know about oil wells that have gone down and the first few hundred meters are just overburdened. So sometimes what we get in terms of a description just really depends on what people are actually looking for. Just a bit about Christchurch Hydrogeology, because this is quite relevant to the background to this project. Under Christchurch, we've got a series of interlayered aquitards and aquifers. And this is due to, in geological history, the coastline moving in and out due to glacial and interglacial periods. So what we get is fine-grained marine or estuarine type deposits, interspersed with alluvial gravels, which are the coarser-grained aquifers under Christchurch. And this sort of the extent to which we get those marine and estuarine deposits decreases as you go to the west, and we start to lose those confining layers. The background to the project that I'm going to talk about was, it was actually some work that wasn't done by us, it was done by Christchurch City Council. And they wanted to improve wellhead security basically and install retrospectively sealing around the annulus of the supply wells. In order to do that properly, they really wanted to know exactly what the depth was to aquitard, so that they knew that they were going well into the first aquitard, and they could seal down to that depth and make sure that you couldn't get any leakage down the outside of the casing. So they carried out sonic drilling at various sites. The logs were logged by a driller and then subsequently corrected by a geologist. We weren't involved in all of that, we just came in later. So that's the sort of thing that you can expect to see in terms of the sonic core. And as you can see, there's a whole range of grain sizes there, from quite well-washed, clean gravels all the way through to what looks like sand there. The image on the right is the original driller's log that from the driller who actually did the drilling, and then the red is the corrections put on that by the geologist. So sometimes there's quite a lot of correction applied. So there were 122 council bores over numerous pumping stations. 85 of those were cable tool drilled, 29 were rotary, and there were some that we just didn't know. And then Macmillan put down 61 sonic logs for comparison. So what we did was assess the sonic drill logs against the existing driller's logs, and then decided to see how accurate or not accurate with the driller's logs. So the question that came up when I was talking about this with others was why are we actually asking the questions, or this question? And we use drillers' logs on a daily basis for so many different purposes. They underpin geological models, which are then used for hydrogeological interpretation, is really the main reason. But more specifically, we use them for building 3D model structures for flow and transport models. And then we use these models for things like assessing allocation issues, assessing contamination transport. So Julian, who sat over there, created the Canterbury groundwater model, and he's used that for things like looking at nitrate transport pathways. We can also use it for things like assessing the one-year travel time around a public supply well to try and work out where the source protection zone needs to be. On a simpler level, we use them on a daily basis to develop a conceptual model of aquifers for aquifer testing. In order to do an aquifer test analysis, we need to know what our conceptual model is so we can apply the right analysis tool. Increasingly, logs are being, particularly sonic logs, are being used in terms of ground source heat pump systems. So identifying key horizons where we might want to stop and say, well, that might be a good horizon for either taking water out of the ground or injecting it back into the ground. And there's a lot of these sorts of systems are going into the ground around Christchurch. So increasingly, Ian's been involved in just trying to work out where's going to be the best horizon to put the injection well down to. Because if you can't get the water back into the ground, then that causes a problem. We use them on a daily basis also for consenting, both for developing the conceptual model of the aquifer system and frequently for assessing what depth cutoff would be reasonable in terms of trying to work out what other wells you might be affecting within the aquifer system. So we use them on a daily basis, and my interest in this was really just, we know drillers' logs aren't necessarily very good, but how bad are they really? Yeah, so just as an example, these two logs are actually two council supply wells that are side by side. In some ways, they're not too bad. They're sort of picking up the same sort of fine grey material at the bottom, but maybe not some of the sort of finer resolution. There's a clay layer there in one log that's not in the next log, and these are all within meters of each other. So the approach was to take each driller's log and at 0.5 metre intervals record the main and specific lithology. So for example, if it was a sandy gravel, the main lithology would be gravel, and the specific lithology would be sandy gravel. And then for each sonic log, again, record the same sort of thing, but we also wanted to record the presence of open framework gravel. So these are class supported gravels where you've got very little fine material, and that's where a lot of the water flow actually occurs within these aquifers. There's often increased level of detail in the sonic logs. For example, they'd be described as fine, medium, or coarse sand, but because there wasn't the same level of detail in the driller's logs, we got rid of them. And we also had to put a few rules in place to derive a common language. So things like peat shell and organics all became under the organic label, and things like pug was reclassified as clay. So there were the main issues that we identified even before we started looking at the comparisons. One is the spatial variability of sediments. They're laid down by this sort of river system, so obviously you can get quite rapid change between a channel type lithology and maybe some overbank deposits. So that sort of rapid lateral change definitely can occur. We didn't really know whether or not logs might have improved or got worse with time, so we had a quick look at that. We were fairly sure that drilling type would affect the accuracy of the comparison. And also, I think, as Ian alluded to, the operator can be, the operator and the person logging the hole can also affect the results. So in terms of spatial variability, we assumed that the similarity between compared bores would actually decrease with distance, but as you can see in that diagram, even when two bores are very close together, there can be quite a lot of difference. So the scale here is from 0 to 100% in terms of each 0.5 metre being able to be compared. But even when bores are very close to each other, we can still be getting less than 25% being correctly identified. There's no strong evidence that that got any better or got any worse with distance. I mean, that trend does show a slight decrease in comparison with distance, but it's not stunning. We also had a look at, like I said, at the comparison between older bores and the sonic logs and newer bores and the sonic logs. And again, nothing very much that we could say about that. So nothing much has changed with time. If just looking at it on the whole, what these three bar charts show, basically a description of the main lithologies from Brown et al. Of 1995, and then just grouping the sonic logs and the driller's logs into the main lithologies. You can see that in terms of percentages, we're getting reasonably similar amounts of gravels. Brown et al. Didn't seem to think that there was any sand in there, but both sonic and driller's logs are suggesting they are. But the big difference that keeps coming out is there's an awful lot of description of clay in driller's logs, which really wasn't reflected in the sonic logs. So just in terms of comparison again, in terms of the labels on these diagrams, if it says BH and then a name, that's the sonic drill log. And if it's an M35 or BX24 name, that's the ECAN well number. So in this case, this is the sonic log, and this one is the old driller's log. So agreement between driller's logs and sonic logs, 22% of the specific lithologies and 54% of the main sediment types were identified correctly. But in some cases, you see two log pairs that showed very good agreement between the sonic and the driller's log, but you also saw some really poor ones as well. As I said, frequently there was a description of clay instead of silt or sand, and having talked with Ian quite a lot about this, it seems to become embedded in our description of sediments in Christchurch and Canterbury. This sort of description of clay-bound gravels is in almost every driller's log that you look at, but in reality they're silt or sandy gravels, not really clay-bound. It's not to say that suddenly we haven't got any confining layers in Christchurch. We certainly have. You wouldn't be getting artesian pressures of 10 metres if you didn't have something that was really quite competent in terms of a confining layer. One of the slightly concerning things we noticed fairly early on is that gravel does get described as fine-grained material and vice versa. And this is quite likely that this is something down to the actual sampling interval that the driller would have been looking at, and maybe they're not quite looking at the same interval as the interval we're looking at on the sonic log.
When you're talking about clay, are you talking about clay minerals, or are you just talking about grain size? Are they identifying something as clay because
they're identifying clay as a very fine-grained sort of, as in a fine-grained plastic material. Yeah. I won't go into that in any detail, but that's just looking at the original driller's log versus what was observed in the sonic log. What I didn't say is we've just accepted that the sonic logs are correct. I mean, there are some issues with them, but they're our source of truth for this purpose. So when observing gravel, the driller's logs and the sonic logs overall, we're getting there. Sand wasn't quite as good, probably about 50 or a bit over 50% that actually compared well. Silt, obviously, this is where the problem with the clays comes in. 65% of what the sonic logs described as silt was being described as clay by the drillers. There could be quite a variability in drillers' logs at a site. In this case, the two logs closest to each other here are they're both drillers' logs, but one's obviously got a reasonable thickness of clay up near the top of the hole, whereas the other one is describing that as gravel. Again, if it's a thinner lens, that might be accounted for by lateral variability, heterogeneity, but it seems a bit surprising when you get a significant thickness of what's been described as clay. We compared drilling methods, and as I said, the two main ones are rotary and cable tool drilling. Looking at cable tool drilling, the specific lithology was identified correctly 23% of the time and 14% of the time for rotary. And the main lithology, it was 57 and 38. So this way of displaying the data Ella came up with, which is quite neat. If there's a blue dot, basically that's been correctly identified, and then the size of the circle is basically the frequency with which we've got that. Again, so the sands are identified reasonably well for cable tool and for rotary, and gravels are generally. But then you do get these odd ones like sand that's been described in the driller's log, which is actually gravel, and other oddities like that. But the other area of confusion is really usually around sand and silt, which is being described as clay. Comparing drilling companies was quite interesting because I wasn't really expecting to see such a big difference, but some drilling companies are obviously doing a little bit better than others. We decided not to name them though. But it is relevant. I'll talk about it later. It is relevant. It's one of the better ones. So in terms of just sort of general differences in lithological classification, obviously the clay and clay-bound gravels are frequently described in drillers' logs, but not in the sonic logs. And it does seem that the clays are very rare according to the sonic logs. And of course, it's therefore highly likely that drillers' logs are over-reporting clay. The other thing was there's no cobbles observed in sonic logs. I didn't really get a chance to talk to Ian about that and whether it's just he didn't happen to hit any or whether maybe they're being over-reported in drillers' log. So in terms of what the main concern at the start of this was really whether we could define the confining layers better, if we could really focus in on where they were. So in general, the confining type layers, so those silts, are generally identified reasonably well, but there are some occasions when they're identified as gravel. But what we wanted to do is really make sure that the thick confining layers that are under Christchurch are adequately identified in drillers' logs as well as in the sonic logs. So for every 5 meters of silt identified in the sonic logs, we actually looked at the drillers' logs across that 5-meter interval and just said that is there evidence of a confining layer there. And on the whole, the drillers' logs did correctly identify those same horizons. And sometimes they weren't perfectly aligned, but you've heard some good reasons why you wouldn't expect them to be. And as I said, they generally identified clay rather than silts, but all the logs did tend to be picking up those thick confining layers, which is quite reassuring. Gravels, as I said, were generally quite well identified, but strangely, Rotary was better than cable tool at identifying the gravels. But the other thing I mentioned was the open framework gravels. The open framework gravels allow most of the water flow and potential contaminant transport through the aquifer system. So there was work at Burnham that suggested that 98% of the flow was through about 1.2% of the sediment thickness. So most of your sediment thickness is actually very, very slow moving groundwater, but you've got these high permeability channels that are taking a huge amount of the flow. So what we wanted to do was say, well, we've got an opportunity here just to have a look at those open framework gravels and see how prevalent they are under Christchurch. So for every 0.5 metre interval, we looked at it and said, is there any evidence of open framework gravel? So this is the sort of thing we're looking at here. So little evidence of any matrix material, and there may be evidence of iron staining. And what we found was actually overall the sonic log depths, those accounted for about 7% of the total sonic log depth. So Burnham might be at the sort of very low end, and this 7% might be more typical. There is always a chance that there were finds then that they've got washed out slightly, but from Ian's description, there isn't too much opportunity for that. So in terms of, Ella decided to try and see if we could improve the reliability of drillers' logs. So what we did was removed all the Rotary logs because they seemed to be less reliable. Removed ones that had lithologies described as clay. We took out 2 of the drilling companies, and then we compared 0.5 metre interval of the sonic log with 1.5 metres of the driller's log. So we're giving it a little bit more leniency in terms of actually getting the exact horizon right. And what we got then was actually that 41% got the specific lithology correct, but 86% got the main lithology correct, which is quite a big improvement. So I think that the lesson we've learned from this is actually we can make a lot more use of drillers' logs and we can have more confidence in them if we do a little bit of assessment of the data and cleaning up the data. So we don't use everything, but we actually go and use those that we think we can rely on more. So just in conclusion, there's a high degree of variability in the quality of drillers' logs, and some of that is down to drilling technique, some of it's down to operator, but some are better than others. Clay is obviously well overrepresented, but on the whole, the thick confining layers are probably very well classified. I have got some concerns about gravel being classed as silt or sand and vice versa, but some of this will be down to some of the issues that Ian raised in terms of things like rotary drilling, when you really can't have too much confidence in exactly where samples have come from. But I think in conclusion, really, I think if you're going to use all logs and not look at them in any detail, you need to just bear all of this in mind and be aware that you are going to get some oddities and things that don't sort of fit in with everything around, so don't try too hard to make them fit in. But you can refine the logs used in order to have greater confidence in them. And I think that's the end. Thank you.
Thanks both of you, Ian and Helen. Really good talk, and I think that this will start some more research and some more discussions within the geological community and the hydrogeological community. So really appreciate this. And I'm happy to take questions. Are you happy to take questions? Sure. Yeah, sure. And let's see what we've got here in terms of online audience. We have quite a big number of people that joined us online, and thanks to all of them. So any questions from the online participants, please put it in the chat. Or yeah, that will be the easiest way to go about it. Until we start getting some questions from here, anyone from the audience here with any question?
Hopefully loud enough. What's the appetite, I guess, regulatory-wise or academic-wise, in terms of downhole geophysical logs of water wells, which is reasonably standard practice of minerals exploration and mining? I realise that whole stability and having a steel casing in the ground narrows the options, but it doesn't eliminate the options. Is there any sort of appetite there or any studies out there in terms of the gravels and what they're doing?
Well, I don't know if you want to answer as well. All I would say is that we have talked incessantly about this since I moved to New Zealand. I came from the UK where we had lovely open holes in the chalk which you could run every geophysical tool down you liked because they were just open. Came here and it's like surely there's something that we could use, but the steel casing causes an issue with that. We have debated about whether it's something we could do during drilling if you're keeping the hole open with muds, but haven't really got very far with that. There are things you could do to look at, say, things like casing integrity, which are useful, but so many geophysical logs are just stuffed by the steel casing.
Just to add to that, we sort of played with it a little bit as well, mainly because of the mud rotary. We're getting very little confidence in what we're going through, and wanting to use the benefit of the rotary mud for the speed of the work, but then trying to reinforce that with technique to give us confidence about where the aquifers are, for example. I mean, the comment I'd make, and perhaps you may know more if you're in this game.
Excuse me, people can't hear us online.
Sorry. Is unless we had very contrasting layers, which you may get more in Christchurch City, the work we were doing was more up country where there isn't a stark transition between, say, a gravel and a bedrock or a gravel and a clay, and we just weren't seeing anything that made sense to us. But maybe there's some more interpretation to be had there.
Yeah, I was thinking along the lines of gamma, which means the natural radiation does work through.
Yeah, we were using natural gamma.
Yeah. So I understand the point here about the definition of.
Yeah, there wouldn't be enough.
Yeah. But if you can come up with a tool, we'd love to know.
I can't see the questions.
Oh, one thing I've got on
All right.
what was the percentage of bores removed from the total data set in order to obtain the end results?
So the question is about the percentage of.
No, you put me on the spot a little. Can you remember, Ella? No. No, sorry. I can find out though if I'm not sure who asked that, but if they want to find out, I can look it up and we can work it out. Yeah.
Well, I have a question here. When you drill and you get the cuttings, you get some samples. Then do you have any standard to which you describe your samples? Do you do self-analysis or is it just visual inspection? This is one part of the question. And the other thing is that you get kind of a lithological description, but eventually that's not good for all purposes. You need to convert this into stratigraphic units or stratigraphic units if you're dealing with water. So how do you go about that?
I can answer perhaps some of it. It really picks up from what Helen said at the start. It's what the purpose of the project is. So if you're looking for water for example, we would be describing the material from a visual point of view until we got down to the aquifer itself, and only at that point we may be taking a sample for PSD analysis. But that's to inform screen design.
So do you use what they call them, the charts like the ones that ECAN developed after the National Groundwater Association in the States, or similar methods?
As much as I'd like to say yes, I'm going to say broadly, because it is an area of education that is probably not done well within the drilling profession. Yeah, and the variability is huge, and we discussed this earlier on with Helen. If you've got drillers, for example, who are dealing with geotechnical investigations or geotechnical work and environmental work, invariably they'll be working with engineers and scientists, and they have a much better eye for it, and some of the descriptions are really good. On the flip side, if you don't get exposed to that application and it's more sort of agricultural type work, then the demand's not there. So that knowledge doesn't get transferred.
And the conceptual part? the stratigraphic interpolation?
I think it's quite interesting because John Weaver did a lot of work on the ECANS well logs under Christchurch many years ago and tried to give them a stratigraphic interpretation. But then when John Begg did his 3D model, he did a 3D geological model of Christchurch a few years ago, and some of them just didn't fit. And I think part of the problem was if you're just looking at an individual log, then you start to say, oh, yeah, well, that's lineal gravels and that's the gravels and everything else. But if you actually fit it into all the logs around it, you suddenly realise you're a formation out or something like that. So in the terms of the stratigraphy, I think John Begg's model is now probably as good as you're going to get in terms of sort of trying to define hydrostratigraphic units. I don't think there is really, I don't know if there's the interest. I mean, ultimately, what is driving public supply in Christchurch at the depths of public supply wells is to go deep to get away from any possible surface contamination and to go for productive aquifers. So generally, the City Council are now targeting Aquifer 4 because it's deep, it's generally highly productive, it's got artesian head, so it sort of ticks all the boxes. Yeah.
I guess to provide some reassurance that it's not as bad as it may seem. In Christchurch, the knowledge of the aquifers and where they sit and where the confining layers are quite predictable. You know where they are, and that's based on data.
So you start with kind of a conceptual model, and then you try to fit your well logs into that conceptual model.
No, we
That, I think ECAN does that, didn't they? You would just provide the lithological log and then ECAN try and fit it into that.
Yeah, because a few years back, I tried to interpolate and construct a 3D geological model for the Manawa 2 in the North Island. And I had 1,000 bore logs, more or less, in that catchment. I couldn't do that at all without a conceptual model. So it was really that you understand the geological history, and then you know that in this area I expect this formation, in that area I expect this sequence, and then you start making sense of your individual well logs. Other than that, it was really mission impossible.
Well, I think when I said that the logs weren't always correct, that wasn't common. It was when John Begg built his 3D model that it became apparent that there were oddities here and there where it was wrong. But like I said, it's if you fit it into the overall model, it's obvious that one's not quite right there. Yeah.
A couple more questions come through online.
So you have to.
You made that point.
Okay. A couple more questions. This one's from Andrew Raj. Helen, did you see any relationship of depth to accuracy in the logs?
Wasn't anything that we were specifically looking at as far as I can remember. I mean, it's obvious from what Ian was saying that as you go deeper with something like Rotary and even cable tool to some extent, you're probably not going to get quite as accurate logs out from those techniques. But then also, I mean, we only really went down to generally 20 odd meters depth with these. So yeah, so we wouldn't have been getting that depth effect to any great extent anyway. Yeah.
And sorry. Another one from Rochelle Gardner. Did you have any results based on air drilling methods?
Nope.
Okay. That's that.
No. Do you want to comment on why you wouldn't be using air rotary?
Yeah, so air rotary city with the high groundwater levels and the artesian pressures, just simply appropriate methods to use. You can try, but you'll end up in a world of trouble.
Yeah.
Ian, could you comment on the different costs associated with the different methods?
Sure.
Can you repeat that question, please?
So the question is comment on the cost relative to each drilling method. So for rotary mud versus cable percussive, because they're the two that are roughly the same size and same depths and things like that, they're actually broadly similar, because whilst the cost of mud rotary is more expensive to run, it runs for a much shorter space of time, whereas cable percussive takes longer. It's cheaper per day, but you'll invariably arrive at the same place. It would be hard to compare it to sonic because the depth of diamond is just quite a bit different. Yeah. that enough for you? Or do you want to know the dollar figure? So, well, I can give you the dollar figure. You're probably looking at about, let's say, $800 or $900 if you include the preliminaries.
Hello everyone, sorry, the laptop we're presenting on has ran out of battery. I've just ducked out the back of the room, so we're about to wrap up here. There's a couple more final questions in the room, sorry about that, but thank you all very much for listening in, and if you would like to listen to the final, if you have any further questions, get in touch with Helen or Ian. Their emails, you can catch them through Hesham, which you should have from your registration. So thank you all for listening in. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.